appears to have been cultivated in his righteous children a longing for the temple that encouraged Nephi to seek divine approval in order to build a replica of Solomon's temple when he got here in the New World, which he did. Very interesting. Now, Lehi did condemn the wickedness of the Jews at Jerusalem in 600 BC. Those who were following the false prophets and dismissed him and Jeremiah and Urijah and some of the many prophets that were in Jerusalem at that time calling repentance. He was never critical of the temple, though. That's a subtle little detail in the Book of Mormon, isn't it? He was critical of the Jews, and Nephi was kind of cool toward the Jews. He always called them the Jews at Jerusalem. But they were never critical against the temple at that time. Now, see, later on, with the Qumran community, with the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were critical of the temple. They felt the temple had been polluted, and so what did? They did the same thing Lehi and his family did. They departed into the wilderness up there at Qumran to live the law in its purity. I mean, that's the big theme of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Temple Scroll has a heavenly vision of the magnificence of the rebuilt temple. So they ended up being critical of the temple. Nephi and Lehi never were. They continued the temple tradition. And instead, they look forward to the restoration of the dispersed Jews to the land of Israel, see 1 Nephi 10 and verse 3, and to the proper worship of the Holy One of Israel that would then be possible. See, in his first recorded vision, here's what Nephi says, or Lehi saw a pillar of fire dwelling upon the rock and learned that the city of Jerusalem had become an abomination. See, this is the same word that Egypt was described as, from the ideological viewpoint. Now the Jews of Jerusalem had become like Egypt of old, and it would be destroyed. That's 1 Nephi 1:6 and 1 Nephi 1 verse 13. So Lehi understood from the vision that the Lord no longer dwelt in the temple at Jerusalem. There's no reason to believe that he became anti-temple, as the Qumran community did, as we know. He testified against the people because of their wickedness, is how Nephi puts it in verse 19 of chapter 1. But he laid the blame at the feet of the pastors of the people in chapter 21, verse 1. But he never does suggest that these problems calls for an elimination of temple worship as such. In fact, it was included in the Nephite nation. Leaving Jerusalem, Lehi fled into the desert. He returning to the ways of Israel under the patriarchs and Moses in the wilderness. And he says at the first camp he built an altar of stones and gave thanks to the offering to the Lord with an offering sacrifice. So he's continuing this tradition of the temple worship and the proper types of sacrifices. It's very interesting that this is part of the education of the father to the sons. I wanted to just share that with you. Now, I discussed the Amherst Papyrus 63 and several of the early Greek magical papyri materials that shows the combination, the mix between the Egyptian script and the Hebrew language, or the Hebrew script in the Egyptian language, and so on and so forth. It went all the way back to 1400 BC and came all the way down through to 500 BC or so. And in discussing the various ideas of the archaeological materials with the Lachish letters and how they show this tradition of an Egyptian and a Hebrew scribe and all, John Welch, once again, keep your eye on John Welch. He speaks softly but carries a very big stick. His research is meticulous, impeccable, phenomenal, and always interesting and exciting. He's cautious, but he's bold at the same time. His Chapter 13, the narrative of Zosimus. Now this is the history of the Rechabites and the Book of Mormon. This is in the Book of Mormon authorship revisited, the evidence for ancient origins from farms. This is the 1997 copy. He discusses the narrative of Zosimus. The raw core is very similar to Nephi's account of his leaving the wilderness because he saw a vision of God. He saw angels, and those angels taught him about a coming Messiah, and they left the main city, Jerusalem, about to be destroyed, and went out into the wilderness to live the law in its purity and to further worship the Lord, and some of their dreams about the tree of life and so on and so forth are extremely interesting parallels. I won't get into all of the details, he says. Let me share some of the details that he shows, though, between Zosimus and Nephi. This is on page 327 here. They were both dwelling in the desert. They were being led by prayer and faith. They wandered through a dark and dreary waste. They, being caught away to the bank of a river, they crossed to the other side of the river, or the abyss, and passed through a great mist. They came to a tree whose fruit was most sweet above all other fruit. They ate from the tree which gave forth from a living fountain of living waters. They were greeted by an escort. They were interrogated as to their desires by this escort, both Zosimus and Nephi, remember, the angel. Behold, a vision of the Son of God, or like those who are the sons of God. They kept record on soft plates or tablets. They recorded the history of a group of people who escaped the destruction of Jerusalem at the time of Jeremiah, and they were led to a land of promise, of great abundance, because of their righteousness. They practiced constant prayer. They kept high standards of chastity and piety. They received revelations concerning the wickedness of the people of Jerusalem and in the old world, and they obtained assurances of the mercy to be extended to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the world who repent and enter into the covenant with God. Whew. This narrative of Zosimus is extremely interesting. Welch compares it for several dozen pages. Highly recommended study. But once again, we have an ancient Near Eastern text which has so many similar themes to the theme that we find in the Book of Mormon. Now, this doesn't prove that one came from the other. It just demonstrates that this type of a literature is what we would expect from an ancient text, and we absolutely get it with the Book of Mormon. No questions asked about that. So, and we can approach this from various different archaeological, as well as historical, as well as literary interpretations of discovered texts. And so this is really exciting to see the ancient milieu with which the Book of Mormon opens, and the comparison, the parallel with the actual way that parents would treat their children and their families and their in-group based on ancient Israelite culture, tradition, and custom. The Book of Mormon has all of this in its opening first page. It's a marvel to behold.